Okie dokie. 14 August, this and that information. Now we're returning to rent. Remind ourselves some things about rent to reintroduce the idea of rent and its position in terms of the things we've been looking at. That is the creation of surplus value and other matters in terms of capital, its relation to capital. Now, maybe a subtopic, but it truly is the formation of how a consumer society operates. Well, so much so that rent seeking became the way in which one would talk about it, that seeking it was as good as creation and as good as extraction in that particular sense, because it does describe a variety of intersections of things that are all exchanged. Problematic thing, of course, is that it's on the one hand not use, but it is, or you could describe it as something like pure capital. Now, it's often represented as somewhat epiphenomenal and ephemeral relative to property or land, labor, and capital. But it sort of intersects all of them, as I hope one can see, because it is an allocation of personal resources or subjective resources that constrains agency in that sense. It does, of course, refer more specifically to land and in some ways differentiates land from capital on the one hand. On the other hand, creates new forms of capital, or at least one element of capital. So here we go. This is an article by Roger Congleton called The Political Economy of Rent Creation and Rent Extraction in a mutually edited book, Congleton, Groffman, and Voigt, the Oxford Handbook of Public Choice, 2019. Public choice, of course, is, has its own elements of, once you invoke public choice, then you imply private choice. And private choice has its own set of issues that public choice may not necessarily account for. On the other hand, it does when you see the actions of certain individuals in the public sphere. So lots to do there. All right. Political Economy of Rent Creation and Rent Extraction, Roger D. Congleton. Introduction, Rents and Rent Extraction, on the Nature and Origins of Rents, plural. The theory of rent was among the first to be worked out in economics. Ricardo, 1817, noted that above average returns were realized by owners of land that is especially productive or well located. The use of such land generates an extra profit beyond that required to bring the marginal piece of land into production. Ricardo referred to the extra return or profit on high quality or well situated land as a rent. Ricardo's idea was generalized to characterize the notion of quote unquote economic rent, which is the amount paid to owners of any factor of production beyond that required to keep in its current use. Now, that can be described in a variety of ways, But anyway, in other words, it is the extent to which one's reward or rate of return above that of one's best alternative. Although both the reward and alternative are at least partly subjective assessments, rent in this sense can be approximated as accounting profit less the return typically earned by comparable persons, occupations, firms, or industries. Rent and economic profit thus have identical meanings in that context, and both differ from accounting measures of profit, except in the odd case in which one's opportunity cost rate of return is zero. Now, there is some confusion about the proper meaning of opportunity cost rate of return, insofar as one could always sell a stream of net revenues for the present value of that stream, it can be argued that profit is always and tautologically zero. An asset's current resale value can be regarded as the opportunity cost of holding on to that asset. However, if an owner's rate of return is calculated relative to other investments that could have been made at the same time that his or her investment was in fact made, positive profits are clearly possible. For example, an asset's resale value might rise much faster than that of other assets that could have been purchased, or a new product might sell at a much higher markup than others that could have been brought to market. In such cases, owners clearly realize above average returns and so realize positive economic profits or rents. It is the second meaning of opportunity cost that is used throughout the present chapter. An amplification of Hobbes's 1651 characterization of anarchy is that it is ultimately the protection of the state that allows rents to be realized. In the absence of such protections, conflict over productive resources would tend to consume any differences in profits or rent benefits or net benefits associated with controlling them. Ownership is an ancient legal institution and is, as noted by Hobbes, the ultimate foundation of civilized society. State protection of ownership rights discourages most persons from attacking or otherwise taking properties that generate above average returns or net benefits from their owners. Without protection of ownership rights, contests for control would ensue, and the rents would be fully dissipated by efforts to defend or take possession of all valuable resources. In this sense, essentially all rents are products of government policies. That may be overdetermining that, but anyway, rents in the private sector are largely consequences of laws that define what can be owned and the use and transfer rights associated with ownership. Ownership is largely determined by chains of transfers from original owners that are ultimately sustained by the coercive power of government. Laws in civil societies tend to limit forms of conflict to ones that tend to be productive, as with competition in markets, elections, and sporting events. Many of the laws defining the rights associated with ownership and contract are ancient and unchanging, although not all of them. As a consequence of the latter, rents can often be obtained by modifying existing or creating new rights in a manner that increases the revenues of particular persons, firms, resources, or industries. The creation and extraction of rents are thus inextricably related to one another. Rent extraction is simply the activity or activities necessary to realize rent. The simplest form of rent extraction is that associated with the ownership of an especially productive or desirable property, that is, a fertile farm, field close to market, a spring in a desert, a productive oil well, a house with an attractive view, and so forth. The rents created by various forms of ownership are extracted by their owners, which provides the foundations and motivations for most private economic activity. Let me mention the footnote here. There is evidence that Hobbes's characterization of life before civilization is roughly correct. That is, it presents extensive evidence of warfare among early tribes that was not all-encompassing, but absorbed significant human and capital resources. Okay, back to the text. That rents can be created and extracted through public policy innovations implies that prospects for rent extraction also motivates much of policy or politics and policy formation. Section B, rent and rent extraction. The process of attempting to profit from policy reforms is often referred to as rent seeking. Rent seekers may, for example, lobby government officials for the creation of barriers to entry in otherwise competitive markets that increase or protect their current and future profits. Such policies, in effect, generate rents by creating new ownership rights in the revenue streams associated with the sale of particular goods or services. Such policies give recipients the right to exclude others from their market or service area, such as landowners can exclude their neighbors from their fields. Let me break for a second and note, of course, warranty protections, certain types of subscription services also are kind of rents, aren't they? Anyway, back to the text. This effect is magnified by economic growth in markets for services for normal or superior goods. As population and average income increase and prices rise for consumers and profits increase, as population and average income increase and prices rise for consumers and profits increase for those protected by barriers to entry. Section C, rent sharing and rent extraction. This is not to say that the current asset or firm owners realize all the rents associated with a new barrier to entry. The rents may be shared in various ways. For example, a privileged taxi cab owner's rents may be shared with its drivers or with the politicians who graciously adopted the policies that produced their rents. In some cases, rent sharing may reflect the generosity of the rent owner, but rent sharing may also be a consequence of rent seeking and extraction by others. Drivers, in the taxi case, may threaten to strike for higher wages or benefits. Those who supported that monopoly may expect campaign contributions, that is, legal ones, or cash kickbacks, illegal, in return. We can see a variety of those operative presently. A monopoly firm's employees may form a union and aggressively bargain for a share of the firm's rents, average wages, and benefits. Now, if they succeed, they will have wages above their opportunity cost and share in the rents created by their firm's protection from marketplace rivals. Similarly, politicians may threaten to reduce a monopolist's profits by allowing other firms to enter the market, raising taxes, or increasing regulatory costs unless campaign contributions are made, the VIG, or kickbacks are paid. Insofar as such threats generate larger campaign contributions and thus an increased probability in holding office, politicians will share the monopolists or protected industries' rents. They will have more resources available and thus more secure political careers than they would otherwise have had. And you can see how lobbyists fit into that. Rent creation, rent seeking, and rent extraction are often possible and can be profitable in both the public and private sectors. And the potential for rent extraction that induces all rent-seeking efforts. Section D, rent extraction and the origins of rent distributing contests. In the standard theoretical analyses of rent-seeking contests, 1, the rents are created, 2, the rents sought after, and 4, awarded. After that, 5, the winners extract their rents. The focus of analysis is normally the second step, the contest phase of this process. Variations in the assumptions about the contest allow the effects of institutions, that is, contest design, on the efforts of rent seekers to be carefully studied. However, the usual analysis abstracts from both the creation of rents and the reason why contests are used to distribute the rents created. With respect to government policymakers, these are likely to be matters of choice rather than accident. The rent extraction literature suggests that it is the government official's expectation that he, she, or they will profit from creating the rents or the contest for those rents that motivates the entire process. It is the efforts of governments and government officials to extract a share of any rents created that was termed rent extraction by McChesney. This remainder of this chapter explores various relationships among rent creation, rent seeking, and rent extraction. It focuses, for the most part, on efforts by government officials to extract some share of rents created by them, but also discusses rents that emerge in the private sector. Now, this broad topic of rent extraction extends well beyond that undertaken by governments and government officials, but many of these are beyond the scope of the public choice literature, and so are beyond the scope of this chapter. Section 2 provides a short overview of private and public sector efforts to create rents. Section 3 provides an overview of the politics of rent creation and rent extraction. Section 3 also analyzes the welfare implications of different forms of extraction with the aim of explaining why some forms of extraction are illegal, and should be. Section 4 summarizes the discussion, makes a few suggestions for future research. Section 2, Roman numeral 2, rent creation. Subsection A, privately generated rents. As a point of departure, imagine a setting in which all assets are purchased at time zero in perfectly competitive markets. Note that we've talked about this problem before in the context of the heterodox theory. In such a market, a perfectly competitive market, every asset sells for the full risk-adjusted present value of future returns, including any of those Ricardian rents. At these competitive market prices, every asset earns the same risk-adjusted return, and so there are neither economic profits nor economic rents. Now, given this point of departure, a world without rents, economic rents may nonetheless emerge in a variety of ways. These may be created privately under a stable civil law, or publicly through refinements of existing laws, regulations, and other policies. In an environment in which all buyers have the same information and imagination, extraordinary profits, as rents, are simply a matter of luck. Well, yes, no. Some assets increase in value because of unanticipated increases in demand or reductions in supply. Unanticipated new demands for scarce locations or minerals will generate unanticipated Ricardian rents. An accident in a lab may lead to a new antibiotic or new material, as with penicillin and nylon. Let me go to the footnote 3. For example, one strand of the efficient auction and contract literature attempts to characterize contracts that can reduce employee rents and increase those of firm owners. Such contracts extract employee rents. For example, Kramer and McLean, 88, or Hua, 2007. Footnote 4. McCormick et al., 1986, note that the full capitalization of streams of rents generated by past policies can reduce interest in deregulation. Here, the assumption is that both public and private sources of rent from the past are fully capitalized into asset values, wages, and prices of services. The policy-based rent capitalization argument was first developed in Tulloch, 1975, Gordon Tulloch's work. Back to the text. Economic profits in perfectly competitive markets can only be realized, as Knight, 1921, argued, because of uncertainty and associated luck, but not intent. So that's a question left for other matters. In a setting in which people differ in their abilities and information, rents, different endowments, let's put it that way, rents may be intentionally created through various actions and investments. For example, relatively well-informed explorers may discover and purchase new mineral deposits that were overlooked by the average prospector. An especially insightful inventor may imagine and create new products with high potential demand that were overlooked by others. The inventors of new drugs, better driving, or more economical automobiles or smarter cell phones tend to realize monopoly profits because at the instant of invention, no similar product is available from others. Similarly, an artist that invents a new attractive form of painting, styleless commodity, may earn rents on his or her invention or talent insofar as there is a significant demand for his or her painting, sculptures, etc. A firm that works out a new, less costly method of producing a well-known product may also realize well above average returns because of its lower production costs for familiar products, as with Alcoa's implementation of the Hall-Heroult process for refining aluminum, which led to Alcoa's near monopoly position in the aluminum market in the early 20th century, and supported a couple of liberal arts colleges. Well-informed speculators may purchase assets of various kinds that they have reason to believe will rise in value in the near future and realize profits when they do. Now, such innovators realize monopoly profits from the greater insight or knowledge. The greater or higher than average returns are not always realized at the instant of genius, but accumulated as production is organized and products brought to market. Markets reward persistence as well as insight, as with Edison's light bulb and Marcus's, Benz's, and Ford's automobiles. Successful innovations generate monopoly power, which allows higher than normal profits to be realized. See electric vehicles. Many of those rents from innovation are temporary and are competed away as other entrepreneurs follow their lead. In a few cases, rents may be permanently realized by producers that enter markets that are too small to support more than just one efficiently sized firm, or because of first mover advantages. Speculators may anticipate changing patterns of living that tend to increase the value of various locations and purchase land in such places. Such natural monopolists realize above average returns because of the lack of competition from good substitutes. Moreover, even especially talented innovators or well-informed speculators bear the risk that their relatively more accurate expectations will be disappointed. The pursuit of rents through experimentation and other forms of research consume time and energy and is not always rewarded. Most of the innovation that occurs in the private sector can be regarded as productive or welfare-enhancing forms of rent creation and rent extraction. Consumers benefit from new products brought to market by innovators and from the lower prices induced by prospectors bringing new minerals, that is, new inputs to market, and innovations that reduce production costs. Successful speculators drive prices toward their appropriate levels, which encourages a more efficient use of the resources replaced. Resources are shifted from lower to higher value uses. Such forms of rent creation, seeking, and extraction reflect the boundaries set by well-functioning systems of civil law. Nonetheless, some forms of private rent seeking tend to reduce the aggregate net benefits from market transactions. For example, a talented organizer may assemble an effective cartel, or an especially cooperative group of firm owners may coordinate their pricing and output decisions to function as if they were a cartel without a formal organization. Such groups of producers create and profit from monopoly power without benefiting consumers. Indeed, the standard Harburger diagrams of losses from monopoly indicate that deadweight losses often are generated. Now, civil law may or may not enforce cartelizing contracts, but when they're enforced or work without government support, rents are clearly created for the producers. Cartels and other monopolists profit by capturing some of the net benefits previously realized by consumers or of their products. Unfortunately, according to static textbook models of monopoly pricing, consumers lose more consumer surplus net benefits than cartel participants gain in additional profits. That's an interesting relation, needless to say. Subsection B, government-created rents. Now, government policies can also create rents in both productive and unproductive manners. They can do so through innovations, that is, unexpected changes in regulatory, tax, and expenditure policies. New policies, like new products, can create new rents. They often increase returns in some locations and industry relative to others, or for some activities relative to others in a manner not previously capitalized into the value of assets, such as stocks, bonds, land, and housing. Government policies may have global effects on rents or relatively narrow ones. For example, an unanticipated improvement to the enforcement of contracts and protection of property claims tends to increase the net benefits associated with all transactions in private assets. Such policies create new, unanticipated gains from trade, that is, both in terms of consumer surplus and profits by reducing risks, reducing transaction costs, and the extent of unproductive forms of competition, i.e., fraud and theft. New Ricardian and monopoly rents are created as the breadth and depth of market transactions increase. You can see there are other associated ways in which you could talk about this, tolls, rents on infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. More localized rents are often generated by unanticipated increases in the production of public services, specifically those that create new scarcity and locational rents. For example, properties near new governmental office buildings generally increase in value because secondary service providers, such as restaurants, gas stations, etc., stationary stores, are more likely to be frequented if they are near clusters of persons rather than distant from them. As a consequence, firms are willing to pay a premium for such locations. Similarly, extensions and improvements of public transport systems tend to reduce transportation costs in a manner that generate new locational rents and increase property values. This is, for example, this type, for example, occurs near highway interchanges and metro stations where population density often increases and locational rents skyrocket. Such rent-generating policies tend to increase aggregate net benefits by extending the size of markets, but in an uneven way that favors some locations over others. As in the private sector, however, not all rent-creating activities generate increases in aggregate net benefits. New rents can be created through various policies that reduce productive forms of competition in a manner not fully capitalized into asset values. Cartel agreements may be better enforced, regulatory barriers to entry may be erected, or new monopoly privileges created. Patent rights may be overextended or broadly enforced in a manner that reduces rather than increases rates of innovation. Governmental purchasing decisions may create monopolies in various specialized markets, such as those for example, military aircraft or regional highway construction. Exclusive service and sales agreements may be negotiated with vendors of various kinds. State universities, for example, often sell the right to be exclusive providers of soft drinks and snacks on their campuses. Some towns sell off exclusive rights to trash collection, cable services, and mass transit. Other policies make it difficult to enter pre-existing markets, which extends the period in which existing firms can profit from both temporary and permanent increases in demand. Entry costs may be increased, for example, by requiring time-consuming and costly licensing and permits, paperwork, or by formally excluding a subset of potential rivals, as with tariffs and import restrictions. New rents can also be created through grandfathering provisions, which exempt existing companies from new regulations or licensing requirements. The latter, that is, licensing requirements, gives older firms a cost advantage relative to new entrants, and so creates economic profits unavailable to new suppliers as demand increases. Unanticipated changes in tax law can also create new rents. New rules that treat some types of income and some types of expenses differently from others can often increase the relative value of skills, assets, and organizations. For example, a tax reform that causes firms in one industry to pay a lower corporate income tax than otherwise similar firms in other industries increases net tax profits and stock values in the favored industry, generating rents for owners of stock in the favored firms, and often higher salaries for their employees as rents are shared. Developing particular skill sets may be rewarded with special tax rates or deductions. Small business owners may be granted new tax deductions that employees lack, and so face a lower tax on income than otherwise similar persons who undertake similar tasks, increasing the rate of return earned in and thereby the value of small businesses beyond those anticipated by those heretofore creating and purchasing such businesses. Tax law changes may also favor some activities or types of assets over others, and so increase consumer surplus or after-tax rates of returns for the beneficiaries and increasing demand for related goods and services. Indeed, even increases in taxes can create new rents by changing the value of tax exemptions and deductions, whole markets of them, as it were. For example, unanticipated increases in tax rates tend to increase the tax savings associated with the deductibility of interest on mortgages, which increases demand for and value of residential housing relative to other assets for current homeowners. Government expenditures can also create rents by excluding a subset of firms from competing for government contracts and or paying above market prices for services rendered. The rents created need not be permanent to have profitable effects on market prices for assets or salaries paid to particular professions in the short and medium term. It is the possibility that new rents may be created or old rents diminish that induces relatively informed, creative, well-connected, and energetic persons to form groups and lobby for policies that produce rents, as argued by the economic interest group and rent-seeking literatures. If government officials expect to realize a share of the rents created, they will be more inclined to accept the policy recommendations of interest groups that lobby for government privileges. Moreover, innovative government officials may create both new rents and rent-seeking contests without any prodding by private rent seekers if their anticipated share of the rents created is larger than the political cost of such policies, that is, reductions in goodwill, reductions in votes, campaign contributions from those bearing the losses associated with such policies. In either case, anticipated rent extraction can motivate a good deal of policy innovation. Once created, most new rents are contestable and tend to attract resources into games of conflict, as emphasized by the rent-seeking literature. They can reach the absurd, too, needless to say. Section 3, Roman numeral 3, the political economy of rent sharing and rent extraction. Rents are extracted by those who own or effectively control the rights to them. In cases where the rents are created through public policy, that control is implicitly shared between private sector beneficiaries and the government officials and agencies that created them. Now, given that joint control, it is very likely that the rents created will be shared with government officials. The actual division of these rents reflects the bargains reached, which are constrained by pre-existing agreements, civil and constitutional law, and precedent. Not all such distributions are stable, but those that are can be thought of as, yes, Nash equilibria to various rent-seeking and bargaining contests that emerge under society's legal and political institutions. A remainder of this chapter focuses on some commonplace methods for bargaining over and extracting rents. Subsection C, extracting rents by selling rents. The public policies that create rents vary in the extent to which they're reversible, which affects the durability of the rents created. At one extreme are properties conveyed via normal civil law and durable physical structures, a transfer of mineral rights, or electromagnetic spectrum from the spectrum from the government to private parties is much like ones between private parties and tends to be protected by civil law. Major new buildings and improvements to highways, railroads, airports, and seaports are not likely to be undone in the near future. Now, although policy reversals are physically possible even in such cases, such costly mistakes, quote unquote, are obvious to voters, and undoing them is costly to taxpayers. The rents associated with such policies thus tend to be long-lasting. Other policies, such as minor provisions of tax and regulatory codes, can be easily reversed during the next legislative or regulatory cycle. The rents created by such policies are ephemeral and need to be constantly renewed or defended. In between are policies that tend to be durable, but they can be adjusted at many margins. Examples include policies regarding land use, building codes, standards for accreditation, environmental policy, and licensing. Rents established by their core rules and regulations are fairly stable, but may be increased or decreased by small changes at the margin of those regulations. The permanence of the rents and transfer of controls over them has effects on the resources that rent seekers are willing to invest in contests for those rents and the prices rent seekers are willing to pay in auctions for such rents. The more durable a stream of rents is, the more valuable it is to potential rent seekers, other things being equal. Durability implies limits to the strategies that governments and government officials can use to increase their share of the rents after they're awarded to particular groups and individuals. The simplest method of extracting rents is simply to sell them to rent seekers. For example, rights to rents may simply be sold off at public auction. Grossman and Helpman, 1994, developed a model of international trade protection in which rent seekers make conditional offers for various degrees of protection, and government officials attempt to maximize their own utility defined over social welfare and the rents extracted. The more weight that pivotal government officials place on rent extraction, the greater is the extent of the protection sold. Competition to benefit from the protection sold causes all the rents at the margin to be extracted by government officials, although the extent to which inframarginal rents are captured is less clear and presumably varies with the extent of the competition for rents. Congleton and Lee, 2009, note that all pay actions can be used as a revenue source. Many governments sell off monopoly privileges. In the medieval period, this was a significant source of revenue for European kings and remains a non-trivial source of revenue for local governments. They demonstrate that full rent extraction is possible, and the pattern of monopoly power generated resembles a Ramsey tax, with more protection provided for markets with relatively inelastic demand curves and in markets in which innovation is most likely to occur. Now, surprisingly, their analysis implies that the aggregate deadweight loss associated with a perfectly organized mercantilist state can be less than that associated with contemporary revenue systems. Now, of course, all public policies and their associated rents can be sold in this way. The sale of public policies per se is illegal and often violates social norms important to voters or other critical supporters. See the current historical situation. Subsection D, other less profitable modes of rent extraction. Now, a variety of methods for extracting rents are possible in cases in which explicit sales of rents are ruled out by law, precedent, or custom. That government shares of such rents are smaller at most in such cases does not imply that opportunities for rent extraction have no effect on public policy. For example, an elected official that has advanced knowledge of exactly where a new highway or office building is to be built may purchase land adjacent to the project. Oh no. After the siting becomes known, property values tend to increase, creating rents for government officials and other landholders. Footnote 5. Such rent extraction is analogous to that available to persons in firms who trade on insider knowledge, which is not always legal, but is difficult to police. Footnote 6. In other cases, an elected official's own long-standing holdings of wealth may be affected by a policy proposal, and he or she may vote in a manner that generates or protects rents for themselves while providing rents for those with similar interests. Footnote 7. In such cases, office holders typically extract only a small fraction of the total rents created, although even small shares of large rents may influence policy decisions. Other rent sharing occurs through informal bargaining among elected officials and potential campaign donors, as when public policy positions are adjusted to increase campaign contributions or other forms of support that increase an elected official's prospects for re-election. Such forms of rent sharing do not directly increase the wealth of government officials, but may indirectly do so. Footnote 8. So, In footnote 5, in extreme cases, now illegal in the United States, legislators may be given stock or sold stock at below market prices in the companies that will benefit in exchange for their votes on policies favoring those firms or asset sales to them at below market prices, as in the infamous Yazoo land sale scandal of the late 18th century. Quervin and Snyder provide evidence of the increasing wealth of Congress people during the Civil War and Reconstruction, which they attribute to rent extraction. Footnote 6. Such trading evidently accounts for a good deal of the wealth of members of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, who often enter office with more or less upper middle class levels of wealth and leave as millionaires. Footnote 7. Griffin and Anawalt Remsburg, for example, find that legislators with above average wealth are more likely to support repeal or reduction of estate taxes. Yes. Footnote 8. Unspent campaign contributions can be kept by retiring officials and used for post office expenses. Franking. A higher probability, back to the text, higher probability of re-election increases in elected officials' expected future profits from insider trading and also any other rents associated with the authority, status, and esteem associated with high office. Note the lack of enforcement more recently. In democratic politics, it's also assumed that office holders are motivated entirely by non-pecuniary benefits of high office, which presumably increases as their policies confer benefits on voters. In models of office holders that include the possibilities of rent extraction, such subjective benefits of high office are supplemented by the pecuniary benefits of various forms of rent sharing and rent extraction. The methods for sharing rents and the extent to which rents are captured by office holders vary widely. They're jointly determined by the influence over policy that office holders have and the interests of the office holder, including fear of scandals and imprisonment, who may place more or less weight on the pecuniary and non-pecuniary benefits of his or her office. Majority rule tends to reduce a typical official's opportunities for individual rent extraction because there are many possible majorities that can be formed, and so a single member is less likely to be pivotal in forming a majority coalition. Congleton, 84. Nonetheless, rationality implies that pecuniary and career interests are rarely ignored, and thus some degree of rent extraction is likely to be directly or indirectly associated with public policies that create or transfer rents. Christian Cinema, for example. Subsection E, corruption. Many forms of rent extraction are legal or nearly so. Others are not. Government officials have a variety of statutory duties and are subject to a variety of social norms that other persons are not. A private citizen can trade a favor with his or her neighbor, but in his or her role as a public official, a person cannot legally trade a public policy favor for a private one. Such quid pro quo agreements conflict with duties accepted at the time that government authority is acquired. Yes, that Constitution. Such duties are often spelled out in formal oaths of office and by the laws and codes of conduct that characterize the office in question. Footnote 9, such rents tend to increase the competition for high office and the resources invested in those contests, which is one possible explanation for the trend in campaign expenditures. Oh, so much euphemism. A member of the legislation cannot lawfully sell his or her vote on particular bills or for inserting particular language into a bill. A person with security clearance cannot legally sell national secrets. A member of a regulatory commission cannot lawfully sell his or her vote on new regulations. An environmental or building inspector cannot lawfully turn a blind eye to violations of the law in exchange for money and other favors. A police officer should not ignore a violation of speed limits or other rules of the road in exchange for cash. Oh, heaven forfend. Yet such illegal bargains do take place. Such illegal bargains, i.e. corruption, are also forms of rent sharing and rent extraction, and bribery a possible method of rent seeking. see the current situation. Subsection F, ex post facto renegotiation of rent sharing agreements or extortion. Not all rent sharing involves voluntary transactions among those creating the rents and those benefiting from rent creation. Many of the bargains reached are informal ones and subject to endless renegotiation. Now, this tends to make rent extraction an ongoing affair rather than a once and forever transaction. For example, threats to reduce a stream of rents achieved in the past through favorable legislation will induce those whose benefits are at risk to increase the share of rents handed over to government officials. In addition, there are cases in which policy reforms and false accusations can be used to extort payments for policy reversals or ending court proceedings based on such accusations. Gosh, we don't see any of those. Legislators can threaten to raise taxes or pass new onerous regulations unless campaign contributions are increased. A building code inspector or highway patrolman may simply invent infractions and threaten to fine builders or drivers unless payments are received. Section Roman numeral 4, the welfare consequences of rent extraction. Unlike most voluntary transactions in markets, transactions between rent seekers and officials in positions to create and distribute rents often generate broad externalities. Remember, we've discussed that before. In some cases, they're positive. These are positive. It's when a new useful service is provided that generates rent as a byproduct, and others are negative, as when a policy is adopted that generates a deadweight loss or encourages unproductive forms of competition. In either case, there are distributional and procedural issues that are relevant for voters and other potential recipients of rents. We begin by analyzing the welfare effects of policies that create new rents. This is followed by cases in which pre-existing rents are to be redistributed. As might be expected, the normative implications of the two cases can be quite different. Subsection A, normative aspects of rent creation. As a point of departure, assume a competitive equilibrium in which there are no rents at all. As such, all rates of return are just sufficient to attract resources to their current uses, and all assets are valued at the risk-adjusted present value of their expected net incomes. Wages make all, or at least marginal employees, including government officials, indifferent between their current positions and their best alternative. Now, note that there's a utility assumption here. Now, suppose that a new highway is to be built in a new location that joins two major urban centers. Prices rise for land along the entire course of the highway, although not always immediately adjacent to it, as commuters and shoppers realize shorter driving times, and most merchants along the route realize increased business, although some may experience reduced sales because of increased competition from rivals in the commercial centers. The greater convenience of commuting and shopping along the highway may induce new residential and commercial construction, which further increases rents and land values. Assume that those rents exceed the cost of the highway right-of-way and construction and any associated externalities. In such cases, rent creation clearly increases the economic output of the region of interest and social net benefits as well, which, according to welfare economics, makes such rent-creating policies desirable. Similar conclusions will be reached by many other normative theories as well. Note that this remains true, at least for welfare economics, regardless of the distribution of new rents created, if they are largely captured by governments as revenues or government officials as bribes, kickbacks, and campaign contributions. An aggregate increase in net benefits is still realized. Disputes over the distribution of the rents created tend to consume the net benefits created and thus are to be avoided. Disputes over the distribution of the rents created tend to consume the net benefits created and are thus to be avoided. In the limit, conflict over the distribution of rents can consume the entire surplus created, as repeatedly demonstrated in the rent-seeking and contest theory literatures. Such disputes can be minimized, for example, relying on the impersonal forces of market competition to distribute rents, or otherwise minimizing the ability of government office holders to directly influence that distribution of rents by using lotteries or independent commissions of engineers to choose siting and the locations of interchanges. Voters will prefer that such projects be constructed and financed in a manner that benefits them, and so would tend to oppose procedures through which either firms or government officials capture all the rents. Nonetheless, voters may benefit from modest forms of rent sharing insofar as they encourage government officials and firms to discover and implement such policies. Financing the project would ideally rely on tax systems based on the rents extracted. Together, such systems tend to maximize the net benefits of the typical voter by assuring that net benefit producing projects are undertaken while avoiding fiscal commons problems. That's a much bigger literature. Such funding is also consistent with many theories of fairness and with contractarian theories of policy formation. The distribution of any new rents created remains relevant for government officials, landowners, and voters, and also for most normative theories. Now, subsection B, the normative aspects of rent redistribution. Now, if we refer to our assumed zero rent status quo, gosh, that perfect competition, zero rent status quo, the redistribution of rents is impossible because none exist. New rents may be created through public policies as above or through innovations in the private sector. Now, once created, rents can be redistributed, which tends to attract efforts by rent seekers to increase their share of the available rents. Again, it is the prospect for realizing rents, that is, extracting rents, that motivate both actions that create rents and efforts to obtain a larger share of the rents created. In many cases, the rents created are smaller than the net benefits lost by others. In such cases, social surplus is reduced by public policies rather than increased, and contests over the distribution of the rents created simply add to the losses already introduced by such policies, as pointed out by Gordon Tullock, 1967, and emphasized by the rent-seeking literature. Additional deadweight losses may arise in extreme cases where ownership rights themselves become uncertain as property and prices shift willy-nilly, and long-term planning becomes more risky or impossible. In cases in which net benefit increasing rents are created through public policy, it is again the case that contests over their distribution tend to consume resources and reduce the net benefits generated by the policies. Yes, transaction costs. In some cases, the rents may be entirely or even super dissipated by the efforts of rivals in contests for rents. Again, distributive conflict should be avoided to the extent possible, as with mechanical methods of distributing rents or by creating productive forms of competition for the rents at stake. Subsection C, corruption, the normative case against most forms of rent extraction. In cases in which if the rent creation generates costs greater than benefits, rent extraction by governments and government officials simply creates incentives for the adoption of poor policies. And ideally, rent sharing in such cases should be discouraged and authority to adopt such policies limited. Societies that score well on international corruption indices often have undertaken a variety of measures to reduce such incentives. Examples include the takings provisions of liberal constitutions, like eminent domain, etc., and anti-bribery and anti-corruption statutes, rules that reduce opportunities for overpaying for services, also reduce incentives for kickbacks and other rent sharing by eliminating or at least reducing excess returns from government contracts. Generality laws of the sort advocated in Buchanan and Congleton, 1998, also tend to reduce opportunities for trading favors by requiring a uniform treatment of individuals, which would ideally eliminate favoritism. Yes, well, then there's the law. Section 5, Roman numeral 5, conclusions and possible extensions. The process of rent extraction is conceptually distinct from two other related processes, that is, rent creation and rent seeking. All three processes jointly determine the distribution of rents. However, rent extraction is arguably the most important of the three because the other two are ultimately motivated by the final stage. That is, this is sequential, the extraction of rents. Thus, it is rare to find one without the other two. This chapter is focused, for the most part, on the creation and extraction of rents by governments and government officials. Rent seeking and private sector parallels have been discussed only in passing. The simplest explanation for public policies that creates rents is that government officials, both elected and unelected, expect to profit from such policies. That is to say, a good deal of the creation of rents and their associated rent-seeking contests is likely to be a consequence of forward-looking officials with sufficient authority to adopt policies that create rent and elicit rent-seeking. The expectation of rent extraction, usually in the form of rent sharing, can be a sufficient reason for adopting such policies. Now, other interests of officials also play a role. Constitutional and other institutional constraints may reduce the inclinations of such officials to create rents through inefficient policies. For example, insofar as opportunities for rent extraction require continuation in office, the interests of the electorate or more senior officials cannot be entirely ignored. The stronger are the latter constraints, the less rent sharing and rent extraction is likely to take place. However, in policy areas and institutional settings in which such constraints are relatively weak, the mere possibility of sharing rents can be a sufficient reason for the creation of a broad range of policies and for threats to create others not implemented. In such cases, rent extraction must be included among the causal factors in any complete model of policy formation. The domain of rent extraction varies among country and regions because both the legal setting and the extent of electoral and social pressures in opposition to or support of rent extracting policies varies. In societies where corruption is taken as a fact of life or is regarded to be as an honorable form of self-interested behavior, social pressures encourage rather than restrain rent extraction and its associated rent-seeking contests. In societies where corruption is regarded to be an especially dishonorable form of self-interested behavior, social pressures restrain rent extraction and its associated rent-seeking contests. Cultural support for or against rent extraction also tend to affect the internalized norms of government officials and the rules that govern their possibilities for engaging in rent extraction. Indirect evidence that law and culture reduce rent extraction is provided by numerous empirical examples of the determinants of corruption. Footnote 10. Now, research concerning the rules, procedures, and norms that reduce unproductive rent seeking and rent extraction has been undertaken, but much more useful work remains to be done. For example, more could be done to make models of rent seeking and rent extraction more realistic by including the effects of political institutions, legal settings, and culture. These effects are not likely to be unidirectional, as institutions and moral maxims may well be adopted with their effects on rent extraction and rent seeking in mind. Such more complete models in turn are likely to generate new hypotheses that could be subjected to statistical and laboratory tests. Although much has been accomplished in the past half-century of research, many issues remain to be explored. That comes to the end of this little article. It's a useful little chapter if you're collecting a kind of directory or guidebook or textbook, handbook for such matters of public choice. And note that there are many other chapters that overlap with this on the question questions of legal and policy formation, et cetera. Now, what I did was consider that can rent be considered a value form? And yes, it can be relative to, a construction that would include rent and rent seeking or extraction, et cetera, as functions of capital. But that needs to be spelled out. It can be understood through the lens of economic theory, particularly in the context of Marxist economics. In this framework, rent is not merely a payment for the use of land or property, but is seen as a specific form of value that arises from the relationship between capital, labor, and land. In that sense, it has an indexical relation, and it can be, as such, a kind of a value form, because you can see it as Ricardian rent is actually we could say is a contiguity or adjacency theory, maybe. So definition of rent. Rent typically refers to the payment made by a tenant to a landlord for the use of land or property. In classical economics, rent is often viewed as a return on land, which is a fixed resource. Now, value form in Marxist theory, the value form refers to the way in which value is expressed in a commodity. And I would assert that the above chapter on rent or rent seeking shows the commodification at a certain point in the process of rents as something to be sought, something to be extracted, something to be developed. It highlights the social relations underlying economic transactions. Value is not inherent in the commodity itself, but is determined by the labor that goes into producing it and the social context in which it is exchanged. So see, even in artificial intelligence, you see that they've plugged in the labor value question and also the socially necessary implication of it. So rent as a value form, and considering rent as a value form, is essential to recognize that social relations. Rent reflects the social relations of production and ownership. It is a manifestation of the power dynamics between landlords and tenants. But of course, as we saw above, other agents are part of this process. Surplus value. In Marxist terms, rent could be seen as a form of surplus value extracted from labor. Now, the point of equivalence to labor is problematic, as we kind of saw above. I think you can see implied by that, because it is largely expressed in monetary forms, except in certain, more informal bartering situations, pre-capitalist forms. Landlords receive rent as a return on their ownership of land, property relation, which is a result of the labor that historically been invested in that land. So it's kind of a default to a Ricardian idea. So market dynamics, the value of rent is influenced by market conditions, including demand for housing, location, and the overall economic environment. This makes rent a dynamic value form that can fluctuate based on various factors. Implications: understanding rent as a value form has significant implications for discussions about housing, urban development, and economic inequality. It raises questions about the fairness of rent levels, the role of speculation in real estate markets, as indicated above, and the impact of policies on housing accessibility. In summary, rent as value form encapsulates the complex interplay between economic value, social relations, and the dynamics of property ownership, particularly within the Marxist framework. You see how the AI plugged all those things together. This perspective encourages a critical examination of how rent functions within the broader economic system. The beauty of AI in generalizing in the summary paragraph. Anyway, so I've included a kind of question here that is sort of implied in the Wikipedia entries. When the concept of the form of value is introduced in the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, Marx clarifies that economic value becomes manifest in an objectified way as a separate, quote unquote, thing, only through the form of value established by the exchange of products. And that, this idea of exchange, whether it is, on the one hand produced, on the other hand consumed, and in between it's been distributed. So this is, there's lots of other stuff going on. people know very well that any product represents a value, i.e., that there's a normal economic cost of supply or average current replacement cost for a product. Some people have to work to produce and supply it so that others can use it. But according to Marx, various further questions arise about that simple insight, such as how much value is that really? How does that value exist, or what really determines that value? What is the source of that value? How can value be expressed or measured? What explains differences in value? And answering these sorts of questions convincingly turns out to be more challenging than one might think at first sight. And so to extend upon that, it is, in fact, or with all due respect to the current discourse, a metabolic relation, one that has, of course, objective and subjective implications. It has value implications, a commodity form, which becomes commodity money, which becomes money, which can become value, of which can be generated profit and a surplus value of some kind. And it is the measures of all these things at scale that is important to us. So I've gotten to the end of my little yammering here. I've included Roy Bhaskar on critical realism because, in fact, just as Shake's work is a kind of critical realism, although I'm not sure he would brag that. Those are the kinds of things. I've reached the end of my time, and I will get off off the line because it is Thursday and there are other matters at work. So I'm going to cut the live stream and cut the share.